I'm Simon. I'm a director of Tamar Grow Local, as Manda said. It's quite a complicated organisation, and it's probably best if I take a kind of historical timeline and talk through how it's developed over the last decade, and then describe why we've set up in the way that we've set up. And then we can look at what the impact of COVID and current lockdown and the new opportunities, because it has presented some opportunities around local food distribution, how those might play out. And then I look forward to a bit of a discussion later, if that's okay. Normally I like being heckled, so if there are any burning questions that do need to be asked, then do mention them in the chat, and please, Lizzie, do jump in and derail me with questions if they come up. So right back to the beginning then. In 2007, Tamar Grow Local was incorporated as a community interest company, and it was set up as the legal body to hold a lease for a piece of land for an allotment site. And this was in the village of Cowstock. Cowstock is on the banks of the River Tamar. The Tamar divides Devon and Cornwall. And the area of action, as it were, for Tamar Grow Local was always envisaged as being the river catchment, the area around, particularly the tidal area of the Tamar River. It's an area which has a rich history of market gardening. It has a very favourable microclimate. During the heyday of market gardening, there are around 3,000 small-scale horticulturalists along both banks of the rivers, and there was a 2-week earlier growing season even than Evesham. So early produce, particularly from the shoulder seasons, was going up to Evesham to enter into a wholesale market. But already I've digressed. So back in 2007, Tamar Grow Local was set up as a legal entity, a community interest company. If you're not familiar with a community interest company, it's kind of a halfway house between a public limited company and a charity. It has an asset lock to make sure that assets don't get liquidated for the benefit of directors, but it also safeguards its core aims and objectives, which are often the same or similar to charitable purposes. Our community interest company has had its articles rewritten to make sure that it's based on cooperative principles. It's not a bona fide cooperative, but it is organised in a way that every member gets a vote at the AGM. And at the AGM, we have a regular discussion about what we're going to prioritise over the next year. And all members feed into that so that they can really shape the direction of the organisation. So in 2007, Tamar Grow Local held the lease for a piece of land which became an allotment site. And during the process of looking for land, they also met a number of other community groups that were looking for an umbrella organisation to do precisely that, hold a lease for some land. And by 2010, there were 2 allotment sites, one in Plymouth, one in Cowstock, and another piece of land had been offered on a peppercorn rent to do something for the benefit of the community. At this point, Tamar Grow Local was being run by voluntary directors who were putting in quite a lot of time and had held additional events to try and encourage people to get involved in local food production. But it was becoming clear that they couldn't scale the organisation without someone working full-time. So they made an application to the then local food fund and received 3 years of funding to bring someone in to create a network at that time of community food projects. And this was perfectly timed for me to leave my academic role and move back down to my home county of Cornwall so I could bring up my children down here. And also to put into practice some of the things I've been teaching about, but I really wanted to build in this country. And that was this multi-level model of resilience, really. So Tamar Grow Local's aims and objectives are about, well, initially they were around peak oil and food security, but it's morphed over time. And so our aims now are to encourage more people into horticulture particularly, but local food production, to make local food more accessible, and to work around food sovereignty and food equity to make sure people have access to fresh local food when they're living in food deserts in Plymouth. We run a number of projects now. So we currently run a farm start project, an online farmers market, several produce co-ops. We do some consultancy. We run veg bag projects for people experiencing food insecurity in Plymouth. We run cooking workshops. We do a whole host of things. But the story of how we got to there is hopefully quite interesting. The local food funding in 2011 allowed me to be a full-time employee of the organisation, and I started my first day hot desking in Tim Selman's office at the AOMB. And what we did in those first 3 years was set up 28 different community projects. But very mindful from the beginning that community projects tend to have a lifespan of normally about 3 to 5 years. And the reason that they fall over after 3 to 5 years is normally around funding, so there's no continuity of funding, or the lead people burn out. So you get a lot of either volunteer or project leader burnout, or there hasn't been enough contingency planning for how things will succeed, succession planning. But normally it's around grant funding and personnel burnout. And we recognised that this lifespan was very similar to what you see in small businesses. So when small businesses set up pre-virus, around 50% of small businesses were expected to collapse within 2 years. And after 9 years, 90% would have come to the end of their lifespan. And often this is seen as being a failure of that model. So it just didn't work. That community project didn't work. That business didn't work. But we're taking a more ecological view of that. And we're kind of viewing it as these things have a lifespan, much the same as a tree in a wood has a lifespan. And what we want is the overall woodland to survive. And we need to support the conditions that will extend the life of those trees, those businesses, those community projects, but also maintain the sector as a whole, maintain the woodland as a whole. So maintain, in this case, the local food production sector as a whole. So we started a number of community food projects, mindful that they may have relatively short lifespans, but we wanted to be able to network them and improve their longevity. And we also wanted to create a variety of options for people to engage in local food production. So allotment sites are great, but they're really demanding on time. So you need to have other options for people to still feel engaged with a local food system. So we set up livestock cooperatives. So there's a group of people that look after chickens we did chickens for eggs, which is an ongoing cooperative. We did chickens for meat. That didn't work quite so well, so we're not doing that again. But another one that's worked repeatedly is a pig keeping cooperative, the Pig Society. And we also run community orchards, community apiaries. We do field scale vegetable growing, a whole raft of different models for engagement in local food production. So in a community orchard, you only need to be really present in a community kind of form for 3 days a year, pruning, harvesting, and a wassail celebration event. But for an allotment, you need to be there 2 days a week. So it's something for everybody, really, was the idea. And then we were also encouraging people within those community groups to talk to each other, to network. And so there was a lot of mutual support between these projects. The best example is perhaps the community orchard, where some of the land still had trees on it. So we ran chainsaw qualifications to train people up how to fell trees. The wood was then turned into firewood. The firewood was sold to raise money for the orchard. The undergrowth that was left after the trees had been felled, that was where the Pig Society kept their pigs for the first year to clear the undergrowth. And then after that, the sales of firewood were able to finance the levelling of the ground. We ran an apple grafting workshop to instill people in creating apple trees, and then those trees were planted in the orchard. The orchard is also home to a community apiary, and all of that shares the same area of land. There's multiple different community projects, some of which have joined together now, and others which have ceased. So the firewood cooperative doesn't really work now that there aren't that many trees left. but that's something, a model that could go elsewhere. So over the decade that's been going, the shape of the community project that runs the land has changed, but the land is still in use by the community. So we've preserved that piece of woodland, metaphorically, but the trees that are within it, again metaphorically, the different community groups, have changed and morphed over time as their lifespans have come to an end. So we also wanted to get the community projects to sell some of their surplus. This was to extend the geographic reach of local produce, but also to, I mean, if an orchard can sell some of its apples to other members of other community groups, it links the community groups together, and people can engage, albeit for 3 days a year, but they can engage more in a local food system, particularly if they're eating the produce from a sister project within the same organization. It creates this kind of groundswell momentum, large group of people who are all engaged in some form in local food production. So we wanted groups to sell surplus where possible to try and build that, but also to use the revenue to offset their running costs so they weren't dependent upon either membership fees or grant funding. And that could make them more secure in the longer term and extend their longevity. So we're trying to extend their lifespan that we recognize all projects and all businesses and all living things have. At this point, I think I've got a diagram. Can I ask for some feedback here? Is everyone following? Great, right. I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm not that familiar with Zoom. I'm not going to share my screen. Apparently the host has disabled screen sharing. Is that possible to enable that, Manda? If not, don't worry. I'll carry on. So we had a layer, if you like.
I've shifted it. You should be able to share now.
Okay.
It's trying to get me to share, but can you share?
Yeah. Is that?
Yes.
You want to see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lovely picture of a field scale agriculture project. But below it, you'll see these lovely circles, and they describe the kinds of community projects that we set up. And whilst I didn't want to make this death by PowerPoint, there are some nice pictures here which I wanted to show you. This one is, let's go back to this one. This is a model from the resilience literature, and it describes the lifespan of organisms or ecosystems. And we're using it to describe the lifespan of community groups and small businesses. So in the R corner, that's the way you set the business up, and you start to gather your resources together, and you build your model, and then you launch your business, and over time it grows and it gets up to the K corner, the K phase, the conservation phase. And that's where your processes start to become more fixed, and it's also where your resilience is least. So in the R phase, your resilience is really high because you can react to situations that you're presented with. But as your organization or business develops, your processes become fixed, your routines become fixed, you have a set way of doing things, and you're less able to change those over time. And in terms of community groups, that can be one person or a group of people taking the lead as a committee role, or it can be a business that has a particular way of doing things and they're locked into a premises and a particular way of doing things. They can't react or change if suddenly there's a dramatic shift in the environment and the way business has to happen. If they're not resilient enough to maintain that conservation phase, then there's a release phase where things break down, and that's where the connectivity between elements within those businesses or community groups disintegrates. And at that point, it's possible to lose really important things like people's knowledge and skills and experience, but also access to bits of land, access to equipment, particularly if there's been grant funding. This is where assets are liquidated and lost to the community. And what we wanted to have was a way in which we could manage this release phase and use it to reorganize those assets into another form, which could then go through this phase again. So we would be able to maintain the use of the assets once we'd managed to collect them together, maintain the skills and the knowledge of the people in the communities, and just create a different vehicle for managing local food production. So that was the rationale. So these in the models in the resilience literature, these are networked, and so small businesses that set up and fail within 2 years, they would be in this kind of the lower end of this diagram, the small and fast area. And they're trying out new practices and new things, and that's really important. That's where your adaptive capacity comes from. But the lessons that are learned from those can be fed into other organisations which move more slowly. And then above that, you've got more longer standing organisations, which their lifespan they may seem like they're ever present, but they've still got a lifespan that's just much longer. So what we wanted to do was try and create something similar to that, but for a local food sector. So we started off by enabling these quick and fast turnaround community projects and small businesses. And then we started to build this second layer of things which would increase their longevity and support them. So this is where the produce cooperatives come in, but also where an equipment bank came in, and in particular, training events and markets. We started off by selling some of the surplus from community food projects, but also from local producers, because we wanted to increase their range, their geographic range. And one of the things we find about local food producers is they really like producing food. They're not particularly enamored with necessarily going to food markets or finding customers or doing marketing or doing distribution. And that takes them away from food production. So they're able to produce more if another organization is able to take on that marketing and distribution. So one of the things we set up was a cooperative market stall. We took it around to various farmers markets. It was very successful. We started with 6 producers contributing to that. By the end of the first year, we had 21, and there just wasn't.
Simon, sorry, can I just chip in with a quick question? Could you explain what a CSA is?
Oh, CSA is community supported agriculture. So this is an example of a community supported agriculture project. They take various forms. They can be where the community agrees to buy directly from a farmer or grower, and they pay some money up front, and then the farmer or grower agrees to supply food at a lower than market rate but higher than wholesale rate, thereby cutting out the distribution part of the supply chain. If there's payment up front, then that de-risks the initial setup of a farming operation. So we use this model to help a local farmer set up a pig keeping as part of their diversification. So we sold half a pig in advance, and people would put a deposit down. That deposit was then given to the farmer to enable them to cash flow the setup of their pig keeping operation. And then they sold half a pig at less than market rate, but higher than wholesale rate to the people that had joined that community supported agriculture project. So the one pictured is a different style of things. This is at the time, it was a 6-acre field scale vegetable growing project where each member would pay £35 a year. We had about 80 members, and the membership money allowed us to contract a local farmer to do the heavy work, so the ploughing, the harrowing, the seed potato planting and lifting. And the community group then raised other plug plants at home and planted them out. It was planted over such an extensive area of 6 acres that there was easily enough for everybody. So there wasn't that continual argument about that's my 15 foot of onions. There was enough for everybody, and enough to sell surplus. And that reduced the amount that people had to pay for membership. So for £35 a year, people were getting essentially a pick your own veg box for 7 months of the year for £35 a year. And the land was very productive. I mean, one year we got 5 tons of potatoes out beyond what was needed for the membership, and that was able to reduce the costs. It worked very well. They planted around 40 to 50 different varieties of things. There was a lot going into that pick your own veg box over time. Great model, and that's another example of a community supported agriculture project. Often it's used by people who are starting up in horticulture to de-risk their business. So they'll get subscriptions in at the beginning, they've got guaranteed sales, and in return they work really hard to make sure they deliver produce over the year.
Simon, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
The land, was the £35 a week also paying towards rent on the land, or was the land part of the land that you'd acquired at Peppercorn?
So this land was done by a separate negotiation. So the land was given for a peppercorn rent on the basis that it would move after a period, the project would move after a period of 3 years, and any agricultural contracting would go to the landowner. So essentially what happened, although the land was given for free, the contractor was the landowner, so they earned money by working the land. And it worked very well. It's an ongoing relationship. It's still working. So these are examples of this quick turnaround, lower level of project and business, which is where the adaptive capacity comes in. If you want to make a change, it has to start at this lower level. So then we started with these other things. The markets, as I was saying, worked really well. And by the end of the first year, we had 21 local producers and community groups wanting to sell surplus, but there's not enough room on a standard farmers market table to sell enough produce to make it worthwhile for 21 people to be engaged. So we took the whole thing online using, at this time, software provided by Stroudco. We've since switched to the Open Food Network, which is a much better, as has Stroudco, which is a much better platform for managing what is essentially an online farmers market. So at the moment, we work with around, well, it is over 60 local producers, and each of them has a profile on our shop front, and they are able to list their produce and set their prices. And on a weekly basis, we collate all the orders from customers. We close the shop, we collate the orders, we send the orders to the producers, and then on a Friday, they will pick to order, bake to order, harvest to order, bring it to us, and then we put it all into individual shopping baskets and take it out for delivery on a Friday afternoon. So, oh, there's a question, yeah.
Sorry, is it all right to chip in with questions?
No, please do, please do.
Yeah.
I think it makes more sense.
So we've got a question that is the land farmed organically or using regenerative techniques, or did the farmer decide on the cultivation method?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. That is a really interesting one. So it varies. And we have been, for better or worse, quite pragmatic about how we've approached the topic of organic growing for various reasons. So one reason is that we work with multiple different producers of multiple different scales. And that ranges from a lady who will bake lemon curd to order on a weekly basis to regional dairies with 50 plus employees and a £50 million turnover. And we wanted to be able to demonstrate to the existing, quite conservative, for various reasons, local businesses that were already in existence. We wanted to get them involved, and we needed to be able to demonstrate to them that we were prioritizing local food initially, and demonstrating to them that it was a viable project to engage with because it had a decent impact on their bottom line. And then we could start pulling levers around agroecological growing and more sustainable growing. From the outset, we had a set of guidelines which we wanted everyone to sign up to, who supplies the food hub, and those include sustainable growing techniques. And as we've gone on, we've recognized that the organic certification process there are reasons why it is as strict as it is, and it costs what it does, but it does mean it's not particularly accessible for small scale horticulturalists, particularly as they're starting up. And most of our growers are growing on less than 2 acres, and it's not particularly affordable, particularly as a startup, to pay for organic certification. So they may be growing organically, but they won't be certified organic. In the last year, though, we've had a big shift towards both selling more organic produce and pulling those levers on making sure that people are growing more organically. We've done a lot of work around promoting reduction in use of slug pellets, because our biggest issue locally is maintaining water quality, and the issues there are around dishwasher usage and slug pellet usage. And so we're pulling those levers now, and we're at a scale now where we can do that. And I think if we'd started by being, as we might have wanted to be, quite hardcore about saying it all has to be organic, we wouldn't have had the buy-in, and we certainly wouldn't have had some of the organisations with which we now work with us. We would have been seen as a bit too, I'm going to say fundamental, a bit too fundamental, and not as inclusive as we could be. I hope that's answered the question, and I'm sure there's much more to say on that.
Yeah, but let's save that for the discussion at the end. If we can carry on as you did, and then see where we could go to here, that'd be really useful.
Yeah. So I was talking about the Food Hub, which is one of these second-tier projects which extends the life cycle, extends the lifespan of hopefully small businesses, but also community projects. And it allows us to distribute food to people rurally who may not have access to food via local shops, because we do home delivery. And that model works on very small margins. So the producers set their prices, and they get 85p in the pound of the retail price. So we're doing all of the payment processing, all of the marketing, and all the distribution on 15%, which is quite tricky, but it works. We managed to do that by also stocking lots of dry goods, which we're sourcing from an ethical wholesaler in Bristol. And we put a 30% markup on the dry goods, which means they're still on a par or cheaper than supermarkets for equivalence. But that's able to subsidize the markup that we put on the fresh produce to make sure that the primary producers are getting the biggest benefit from this model. So this is one of the second-tier projects, which is all about increasing geographic reach, increasing food accessibility, but also financing our core activities, which means we can then do more in terms of outreach, more training and events, and build up other projects. So other projects include a farm start project, for example. We've taken 12 acres of land on a head lease, market rent, on a 10-year lease, farm business tenancy, and then we've subdivided that into 1 acre plots. On each plot, we've put a polytunnel and some water harvesting equipment, and then we're subletting that out to start-up horticulturalists. And then these growers are able to rent the land at a market rate, admittedly, but over 3 years costs. So we spread the cost of the tunnel over 3 years, and after 3 years we reduce their rent because they've essentially paid for the tunnel. But in that time, they're also having access to our shared market, our shared equipment, and by clustering, we're fostering relationships between them. So what's happened on our farm start site is different tenants have bought different pieces of equipment, and then they're sharing access to those, and that's something that's emerged. It's an emergent property of this system, but which is improving its resilience. So we're trying to, as an organisation, foster links between all of these elements. And in setting up each of these elements, which you can see in this kind of nominal hierarchical diagram, but we've tried to foster communication between them so that they're mutually supportive, not necessarily mutually reliant, so that each of these businesses or organisations could float off and exist on their own without Tamar Grow Local, and they'd be entirely financially sustainable. But they get economies of scale by sharing resources and cooperating with each other to make them even more resilient. And that balance between the potential for autonomy, but the direct benefits by cooperating, that's the balance which we're constantly trying to achieve. We haven't always managed it successfully. Some things haven't worked, as they always do, but we're still here after 13 years, so that's good. And Tamar Grow Local exists nominally above that second tier as a kind of strategic overview. So we can plan, strategically link projects, strategically develop new projects which fill niches which aren't filled, respond to bits of the sector which wouldn't be created by market dynamics because there's a market failure there. So, for example, Cornwall in particular has had funding to set up lots of small-scale food-producing businesses, but the regional wholesale system does not incentivize small-scale growers to scale up. So what we wanted to do was to create a project which would bridge that gap between small-scale production and incentivize people to scale up so that they could outgrow us and then start contributing to a regional wholesale system. So we looked at ways in which we could de-risk that scaling up and still pay a good margin. And it's a very different style of growing, from growing for a farmer's market to growing for a regional wholesale market. And we wanted to de-risk that as much as possible. And this is where we started working with Plymouth City Council and the housing associations in Plymouth. I can't work out how to not stop sharing my screen there. There we go. And we started working with housing associations and the Plymouth City Council on projects around food security and people experiencing food poverty. So over the last 5 years, we've been working on a project called Grow, Share, Cook. And if you want to Google that, there's a short video which is well worth watching. It's only 2 minutes long. What we do in that project is initially when it was set up, it was around food security. And people were referred to the project by the financial inclusion team of the Housing Association, by the food banks, and by Plymouth City Council themselves. And they would receive free vegetables every 2 weeks, delivered by us and sourced by us, if they also went along to cooking workshops to help build confidence around cooking from fresh. It worked really well. We had an independent social return on investment measure on that, and each pound invested in that project resulted in the equivalent of £15.79 being derived in terms of social benefit. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's a proxy measure and it demonstrates that it's a valuable project. That project is now in its 6th year. It's changed focus slightly. It's now focusing on people who have been diagnosed recently with type 2 diabetes or are living with type 2 diabetes, and it's helping them change their diets. Plymouth has a real problem with type 2 diabetes, but also it has a very high level of amputations following diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And part of the rationale of that is that if there's a project which can help people manage their diabetes in a better way, or encourage them to change diets and manage the diabetes in a better way, then that will have a cost saving for the local health authorities and also benefit the people. So alongside the food security work now, we're also delivering free vegetables to people on that project. And again, it's about getting people to build their confidence around cooking from fresh. This project has been quite incredible. It's been the first bags we were taking out to people had to include potato peelers because that wasn't something that they necessarily had in their houses. The first cooking workshops have often been around quite basic knife skills for peeling vegetables or boiling things. But it's been a great project. But in terms of de-risking growing, we're able to source all those vegetables from our local growers, and we're able to buy them at a market rate, but we're able to guarantee that sale for the course of the project, which has been a rolling 1-year base period. So we can go to our local growers and say, right, well, we're going to need 1/2 ton of vegetables every fortnight of these varieties. Would you like to grow them? It's a guaranteed market. You can scale up. And it reduces the risk of scaling up. You don't have to sell it all through us, but we can guarantee to buy a portion of that crop. And that's a way of de-risking small-scale horticulturalists to scale up and hopefully outgrow us and go into regional wholesale. And it's also a way of really tackling some quite major issues in our local communities. We're also doing a similar project with the local housing association. So they've got a project whereby whenever a new tenant moves into one of their houses, they're offered a suite of support. This project's called New Home, New You. And it takes moving into a new house as a perfect nudge point in which to change behaviours and motivate people to make positive changes to their lifestyles. So part of the package they are offered includes free vegetables for 3 months. It also includes cooking workshops. It also includes workplace training and other kind of employment related training. And we are supplying we're over 100 families with free vegetables every fortnight through that project as well, paid for by Plymouth Community Homes. Yeah, I've completely lost my train of thought there. But yeah, these again is a volume of produce which we can guarantee that we're going to buy from local producers, and it allows us to incentivize them to scale up and support the local market. What we've noticed is a mutual support relationship between our online food hub and these projects. So on our food hub, we list the same bag of vegetables that goes out to these projects as something that can be bought on the food hub alongside individual vegetables. And we also list it. I don't know if people are familiar with the suspended coffee, but you can buy a coffee for someone in a cafe, and when cafes were open, that you could go and someone could go in, and if they couldn't afford a cafe, they could have a coffee that someone else had bought for them. Well, we do the same with a vegetable bag, and our regular customers on our food hub are able to buy a vegetable bag for someone on that project. And that's a way for us to provide some match funding into the project, but also to make sure we're able to continue the food security work. So the people are being referred to us from food banks. That's not as easily funded recently as it has been previously, and we're able to support 26 families a year through donations from our food hub, and it's quite a nice thing to do. And also the food hub is able to generate a donation as well. If people want to donate, they can buy a veg bag and add an extra £1 on. And so in that way, that we're building mutual support between what are often quite commercially focused retail projects, but we're building a kind of social heart into that to make sure that it's also related to stuff that's going on in Plymouth. And by joining together recreational activity and commercial activity, we're trying to build a continuum where people can get involved recreationally, discover that, oh, I can make some supplementary income here, go into food production. They can take on a farm start project, plot. They can go into food production. Food production on a small scale is one thing that can fit around other part-time work. And in our area, we've got a really high number of people who are self-employed or working multiple part-time jobs. And production horticulture on a small scale can fit around other work. So it's a very good way of creating a supplementary income that can fit in with other obligations and increase our local food security, improve our local supply chains, and make sure that rural livelihoods are actually viable. So that's essentially what we're doing now. The food hub is the spine of our operation. It's what generates most of our income. It's how we manage most of our sales, be they for community groups or wholesale or other projects. And since the lockdown, we've noticed some very marked changes in how people are shopping. So 6 weeks ago, when people started to go into isolation, we had, I'll start again. Normally our busiest point of the year is Christmas, because if you can't sell really nice food at Christmas, you can't sell it at any point in the year. So we normally have our busiest 2 weeks, the 2 weeks before Christmas. And the week that people started to go into isolation, we had a week on the same level as the week before Christmas just gone. And we started to think, well, this is going to be a dramatic change. The next week, we had to stop our shop early because our order numbers had quadrupled. And that was beyond the level at which we could physically manage with the space that we have available. When we recognised we had quadrupled our orders, that was on a Tuesday, and by the Friday we had rented a town hall for additional space. We had rented a mobile refrigeration unit because our existing refrigeration wasn't sufficient to cope with what we had. We drafted in an additional 7 delivery drivers as volunteers, and we were able to make that quadrupled level of deliveries. That was only achievable, I think, because we got pretty good relationships with our community, and we were able to communicate with a lot of people via all of our community projects. And over the last decade, we've built up a certain amount of trust that we will do what we say we're going to do. And that took time. And by building that community strength, we were able to react very fast. So within 3 days, we were able to manage quadruple our normal delivery numbers. We've had to rein that back because it's physically not sustainable. And we're now doing double what we were doing at Christmas. Well, it's more than that, actually. And we're looking to scale up into a new premises. Probably within 2 weeks, we're going to be taking on a larger industrial unit where we will be able to go back up to larger order numbers, and we'll be able to employ people on a part-time basis to be delivery drivers. I mean, it is lovely to be able to rely on volunteers, but we see volunteer engagement as something that we shouldn't rely on as a business. And also, where we're able to pay people, we really ought to pay people because, I mean, part of our operation is about making rural livelihoods sustainable. So that's where we are at the moment. We're in a period of very hard work and flux. We are also delivering vegetables and fruit free to schools. So the children who are going to schools are children of key workers or children who are marked as vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And we're making sure that they've got some food to take home with them. That may or may not be something that they have at home, but in any case, we want to make sure that it is available. So we're doing that as a separate aside thing. We've increased our deliveries into the Plymouth projects, and we've increased our deliveries via the food hub. We've set up a separate login system, so people who are self-isolating or who are vulnerable have a priority login system. So they have access to our food hub a day in advance, and then we open it to the public. And then we have to close when we reach our number of orders. So for the last 2 weeks, we've had to close within 45 minutes because the total number of orders that we can manage is sold out within 45 minutes. This week, it's taken slightly longer, but that's because most people don't realize we're still working on Bank Holiday Friday. Yeah. I think I've talked enough and I need a drink. So if there's any questions, now might be a good time.
Yeah. Can I ask a couple of generalized questions? Then we have quite a lot of come up in the chat. And the first one is when we talked last week setting this up, you said there were things that you did then that you wouldn't do now. So if we were trying to set this up, we were going to go away and go, okay, next Monday we're going to try and set something up. Have you got any key thoughts of what you would do starting now in lockdown, given that we would like to be feeding people by the autumn, I guess, in the beginning? Have you any key advice?
Yeah, I'd start more by creating the second tier projects. So when we started out, we were in a situation where in the 20th century there had been still up to 1,000 small-scale market gardeners, but by the time you got to the end of the 20th century, for various reasons, including overseas competition, a lack of subsidy for oil, transportation differences, the rise of supermarkets, market gardening had gone into steep decline. And so by the start of the 21st century, you only had 25 growers left, and only 4 or 5 of those were of a large scale to supply regional wholesalers. So when we started, you really had to start with the basic of building blocks, and that was to engage people recreationally and then still take them through this continuum of scaling up to become small-scale producers to the point at which they might think about going on to wholesale. But the situation we're in now is very different. So at the moment, there is so much demand for home delivery, and there are many sources of local vegetables which can be diverted to home delivery. So for example, we're able to manage the increased volumes at the moment because the regional growers who would supply regional wholesale normally, that's normally been going to restaurants and cafes, but mainly like high-end restaurants. And that market's completely gone, but that produce hasn't. So we're diverting that produce into home delivery. And I imagine that is probably the case. And if it's not the case, you can still source things through national wholesale systems to make sure that people are getting food. And then over time, you can backfill the rest of the system. So you can backfill the farm start, you can backfill the recreational engagement in food production. Once people are able to be out and about and having various levels of social distancing. But at the moment, doing something like a community food project is going to be very difficult because you can't bring the community together face to face at the moment. So I would, if starting something from this point of view, concentrate on the wider organizational scaffolding, which for me is immediately a food hub. And a food hub that brings together existing local food producers, of which there must be some, and also enabling people to derive a supplementary income by cooking things from home. That's a bit of a difficult one because they'd have to get environmental health approval. I'm not quite sure how that's working at the moment, but there will be options around that going forward. But also using ethical wholesalers. We use Essential in Bristol to supply dry goods. Others are available. And by buying in from regional, national wholesalers to supplement the veg offer and getting people food. And then the biggest difficulty we found in terms of getting the food hub up and running, and we've had steady incremental growth over 5 years, but the biggest difficulty has been changing people's shopping habits. The food hub works on a weekly cycle where you order a week's worth of food in one go, and then we deliver that on a Friday. And most people pre-virus were shopping on a 2-day cycle. So they'd be back at the supermarket or back at the shops within 2 days to stock up on something else. But currently, people are shopping on a weekly or 2-weekly cycle because they're trying to manage delivery slots. They're trying to limit the time they're going outside. So we're at a point where that system has already been disrupted. And a food hub is the perfect moment for a food hub to start up on a weekly cycle, because that's what people are going to be used to going forward. Sorry, I've just seen your message.
Thank you. Okay, so over to Lizzie for some questions from the chat.
Yeah, great. So thanks for your questions. So going back to the first one, so this is a question from a farmer with particular reference to the farm featured in France. How do they feed animals in the winter, and also how do you control pests?
We don't have a farm in France. I'm sorry, that must be a misunderstanding.
I think, was it referring to something that had been in the news? But how do you feed animals in winter, and how do you control pests?
Okay, so it varies. We don't necessarily control the way in which our food producers feed their livestock. We're trying to encourage pasture fed. We're working with West Country Rivers Trust to try and identify farming practices which can improve water quality, as there's a lot of overlap there between those practices and sustainable growing practice longer term. And they already have a good working relationship with farmers. The farmers we work with are relatively small scale. I know that they are feeding silage over winter. I know that the pig keeping cooperative have been exploring ways in which they can, there's a pun here, wean themselves off soy-based feeds. And they've been looking at non-soy feeding, but it does extend the duration of keeping those pigs, but that's not necessarily a problem for them. We've been looking at supplementing, particularly the pig co-op, with forage and looking at silviculture options. And that is also something that's being looked at by our small-scale farmers in the valley. Is all sorts of innovative ways in which they can reduce their feed bills, really. But that said, we don't work with a large number of livestock keepers. It's mostly horticulture.
Thanks.
Great.
Just before, Simon, we're at 12, so if you need to go at 12, we need to stop. Are you okay for a few more questions? Because
I'm fine. I've got another Zoom at 1, and I wouldn't mind eating something first.
But, we won't go on for more than another 10 minutes, but there were quite a lot of questions. So.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this should be a quick one. So do dry goods include non-food items?
Yes. The rationale there was that we wanted to reduce the amount that people would have to source from elsewhere, so that they increased their average spend with the food hub. And that meant that we can then subsidize the cost that we'd have to take from producers. So the more dry goods that we can sell, the less of a margin we have to take from the fresh produce. So it cross subsidizes. So yes, it is food items, but also household cleaning products. And then we can make sure that they're ecological ones. And we also, well, you can have a look at the food hub if it's open, as long as you catch it within its 45 minutes opening time. But we have over 1,000 product lines, and roughly 60% of those are dry goods.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. What things didn't work?
That was specifically with the farm startups.
Okay, well, Farm Start has been a lot trickier than we anticipated. Namely, the Farm Start projects are an acre in size, and finding people who have a realistic idea of what it's going to take to work an acre has been quite tricky. So we've now started people on half an acre, but the reason we chose an acre was because that's the area of land you need to make any kind of viable living from it. And there was already allotment provision locally of areas of land of a smaller scale. So the biggest difficulty has been managing the Farm Start plots when people give up on them, and it often takes them a period of months to realize it's not for them, at which point the land is covered in docks, at which point you have few options for dealing with that. So I think if we were going to set that up again from scratch, we'd set it up slightly differently and have a demonstration market garden plot where people who are interested in being tenants would come and work, perhaps as volunteers, perhaps as trainees, perhaps as interns for a season before graduating to a plot, or maybe running their own plot in tandem with that. So they could see how to manage things and also see the level of work involved before they took on an acre. That said, I mean, we've got currently six tenants. We've still got room to expand. And some of them have been there from the outset and have expanded into 2 acres. One of them's expanded into 2 acres. So it's just been harder and more complicated than we envisaged. Other things that haven't worked, the chicken co-op for meat was very difficult. And I think if we were going to do something like that again, we would do it as a community-supported agriculture project rather than a cooperative. And that was largely down to the breed of chickens that was chosen, and those members of the cooperative weren't entirely familiar with what happens to those chickens as they reach 12 weeks old. It's not pleasant, but the chickens that are in supermarkets are normally sort of 6 to 8 weeks old, and by sort of 12 weeks old they've grown too fast that their internal organs don't keep up with them. So it was quite distressing for everyone involved, and we haven't done it since. And actually, some of those people just don't eat chicken anymore, which, you know, in terms of understanding the food system, it was a good project. But we probably wouldn't do that again unless it was a CSA. But we do work with farmers and producers of chickens, and we make sure that they're doing it as in a sound way as possible. I'm trying to think of other things that haven't really worked. The funding side of things was interesting. So for the first 3 years, we were funded to develop community projects, and then we basically ran on our own generated revenue for 18 months to 2 years before we got any more development project funding in. And during that time, we weren't able to prioritize the maintenance of community projects, and some of them didn't get the level of support which we would like to have given them, and we lost a number of community projects then due to lead member burnout. I mean, we managed to safeguard the assets and the land and the knowledge essentially, but the food project just didn't go through that cycle that I described as well as it could have done if we'd been able to give it a bit more support. But I mean, that's the nature of precarious funding, and also trying to wean ourselves off grant funding as much as possible. We concentrated on the generating revenue side of things.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Next question, it says, South Shropshire is a fairly remote area with a small population. How does this compare to the Tamar region? How can we find out whether the Tamar model would work in this area, or what would we need to change it to make it work?
I'm not familiar with the area, but the Tamar Valley has around 270,000 people in it, and 245,000 of those are in Plymouth. So the valley is fairly sparsely populated. There are market towns around, but our main area of activity is within the rural area of clustered villages. And most of our home deliveries are to people who live in those villages. And I would have thought that might be a similar situation, although I don't know about the close proximity to a city. For us, Plymouth is an obvious place to work with regard to the kind of more social projects like the food poverty projects and the diabetes project, Road Share Cook and New Home New You. Those things are best done where there's more of a kind of critical mass of beneficiaries, and that is often in a city. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's obviously something we'll need to explore further in this area. Will the delivery drivers be on a short-term contract?
Our new delivery drivers.
Yeah.
So we don't know how long this is going to last. Our ambition is to make it a permanent move to having a higher level of numbers. But initially, the new delivery drivers will be self-employed until we can demonstrate that we can bring them on as employees. And once they're employees, then we envisage them staying with us permanently.
Brilliant. Do you expect that growth in the business to continue post-lockdown, and what would be the risk in taking on new premises?
That's an unknown.
I mean, for everyone at this stage, it's
the sector is suggesting that although there's a big peak in new customers at the moment, we can only expect to retain 30% of those post-lockdown. And that's across the kind of veg box sector. And I think the food hub is slightly different to that, but largely because you get to choose what goes in your weekly shop. You're not getting a generic box where you might not use something, and it's completely different each week depending on what you need in your household. And also the level of service that we are able to provide with home delivery and chatting on the phone and knowing our producers, that's all part and parcel of what we do. And I think that will improve our retention rate. Also, just from talking to people, people have said, oh, this is something I've meant to do for ages, and now this is finally making me do it, and I'm going to stick with this. And that resonates with what I was saying about this nudge point and this disrupting of normal shopping behaviours. And so we're working on a 50% retention rate. And on that basis, we think there's a suitable level of risk, a manageable level of risk to move into an industrial unit. Industrial units are well, at the moment, they're being offered on very favourable terms. So we would get something on a tenancy at will. So rather than being tied into a 3 or 5 year lease, it would be something where if demand did wane, or if the situation changed to a point where we couldn't manage to maintain an industrial unit, that would be an easy out without damaging the business long term. So yeah, we've got contingencies in place. But I think it's an acceptable risk, and we're certainly mindful that within the next 12 to 18 months, it's pretty certain that those delivery numbers will be maintained.
Brilliant. Does Tamar include dairy produce and cereals? In other words, is it able to provide full food resilience?
Yeah. So in terms of our, in terms of sort of the foods and the producers who we sell most of, who are the biggest sector, if you like, is dairy. So we do milk from 2 different dairies. We do unhomogenized milk in glass bottles, and we do homogenized milk from a regional dairy. We also have a full range of local cheeses and creams and butter and everything. So that, yes, we do dairy. We also do fresh fish. So people order fish on a Wednesday morning, but it's not landed in the market until Friday morning, and then it's with customers Friday afternoon. So they're ordering that in advance, and that's a big attraction to the food hub, really, is that kind of availability of fresh fish and meat. Local pasture-fed meat is also something that is very popular, but most of the sales are coming from the dry goods and the vegetables, but that's across a large number of growers. So.
Brilliant. And so one final question, was the community seed bank one of the projects?
We supported a community seed bank, I think. It's hard for me to remember. we had, let me think of this right. So one of the community supported agriculture projects organised a seed swap, and then that seed swap became annual, but it wasn't something that we organised. So I can't claim any kind of ownership or kind of, yeah, it wasn't us. It was something that emerged from the community, which is we may or may not have had a hand in supporting, but thankfully these things do emerge, and good. So yes.
Okay, thank you. We're way over time, and we have to let Simon actually go and get some lunch. Simon, thank you so much for this. It's the chat and the private chats I've had. Everybody has found this extraordinarily useful. I'm going to unmute everyone so you can all say to Simon how much you've enjoyed this. And also, before you all start shouting wonderful things to Simon, I put in the chat Lizzie's and my email. We've recorded this. If you want the recording, let us know. If you want to be part of the follow-up to see how we could make this happen locally, or how other people make it happen locally, then also email us. We will be organising this soon, because if we're going to make it happen, we need to make it happen soon. So Simon, thank you so much. That's been everything that I hoped it would be. And I'd like to keep the conversation going within us, just so that if we find that there are places we could pick your brains, we'll come and pick your brains, if that's okay.
That would be great. I mean, I also just wanted to say that one of the things which we're wanting to do as an organisation is help other organisations replicate what we're doing, and if that's appropriate. And we have a little bit of funding to support my time and the rest of the team's time to help. So if there is anything that we could help with, or any more info we could help with, please do just let us know. I'm always happy to do something like this. So.
Thank you. So Schumacher, we used to click our fingers to say how, instead of clapping, because it was less. So this is Mia Schumacher. Thank you to Simon. Thank you. And you're all unmuted. If you want to shout thank you, now is your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll let Simon go. The rest of you, I'm going to put my email up here again in the chat. Simon, you're free to go and carry on. If you want to carry on and be part of where this goes, mail me, or Lizzie, can you check your email up, because I never remember it. It's got a hyphen in it. And make sure we have your email address. Otherwise, we're not GDPR compliant. And if you only want the recording, you may end up being invited to something. You don't have to come, that's fine. So there you go, Lizzie's email's there as well. So email one or both of us, and if you can put Tamar follow-up in the subject line, it will, we are today, make our lives easier. So our plan is that we will follow this up. We want to make this happen. As Simon said, they've got some funding to kick us off. Goodness knows, I had invited a local MP to this in the hope that we could generate some central funding. He's still quite interested. I will send him the recording. If we're going to feed ourselves, we need to be starting soon. So we need to look at what the practicalities are, how we can bring in the existing market gardening operations, obviously, and then what we can do to get this together. Send us emails to our emails, please. Don't put it in the chat, because the chat dies as soon as we stop the Zoom.
I've saved the chat, so don't worry. We've got everything recorded. So don't worry, if it's in the chat, it's fine.
Okay, that's fine. You can just sort that out. My bandwidth has just been exceeded. Okay, brilliant. So thank you all. I think we're done. Unless anyone's got any, you're all unmuted. If anybody has got any last minute things that you'd like to say, not big questions, that's for later. Now is a good time. Anybody?
Good stuff. stuff. Thank you.
No. Okay. All right. I think we're done.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Thank you all, and we'll be in touch. Have a wonderful day.
And thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.